Alrighty, so hi everyone, and welcome back to today's Food for Thought series. For those of you that are seeing SFC for the first time, we're an advocacy group made by students and young professionals for students and young professionals. We believe that Canada has a strong future in resources, the economy, and the environment. Please feel free to connect with us on Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook at Students for Canada. Today, we are welcoming Grant Strem, the Chair and Chief Executive of Proton. A Calgary native, Grant considers himself an explorationist who's worked for several producers, including but not limited to Paramount, ConocoPhillips, and Husky. In addition, he's also started his own oil company, which focused on light oil, helium, and geothermal resources. Proton was founded in 2015 by Grant and Dr. Ian Gates, who happened to be his former professor. Proton was established to commercialize its patented hydrogen production method and separation technology. This technology is not only revolutionary for the oil and gas industry, but for the clean energy economy as well.
Thanks so much. I'm delighted that you've invited me to speak today. I'd like to actually go, rather than screen share, just more of a freestyle discussion, a little bit about opportunities for students in Alberta first, and then a little bit about how our business works more specifically, and why I think there's such a bright future ahead for all of us. So first off, I think this is a moment in time where it's like near the birth of the internet. And I know that probably predates the recollection of many of the people listening to this, but there was a lot of discussion in very niche communities about the internet that could happen, where communications at a distance digitally could, transpire. But it wasn't until the mid 1990s when this became reality. So I was, at the time watching this and fascinated, and I told my mom I wanted to drop out of junior high and start an internet company, and she said no. But for better or for worse, it was something that was obviously a step change in how people interacted with each other and accessed knowledge, and it was a real revolutionary moment. And I think that the same is true now in the hydrogen and decarbonization of energy movement that's happening now. So we have worldwide had a niche of people who have talked about hydrogen and known about certain technologies and what if, and we could decarbonize this whole thing. And if it's at scale, it'll save money, and imagine the potential of this or that. And it feels very much to me like sort of in the early to mid 90s when people were waking up to the possibilities of the internet. Now people are waking up to the possibilities and the opportunities that come with decarbonizing our energy sources. So there were just a handful of businesses in the internet in the early days, maybe the first few hundred. Out of those, many failed. But if people had bought just one little piece, one little bite of all of them, the few duds would be much, much more than offset by the Googles and some of these other entities that were able to grab market share early and are still dominant today. So I really view it as a similar situation where, there is an outgoing trend of what is now the dominant energy systems, and they're energy systems that, of course, have brought many people out of poverty, and they're not necessarily inherently bad, but there's better ways to do it without making air pollution. And I believe that in a generation or so, people are going to hear about in the olden days when people used to be able to burn oil and gas right in cities, and they'll think that was just a very strange thing, just like we don't see horse manure on roads today. And there is progress. It sometimes feels slower than it should, but it can be a momentous step change. So I guess, how does Proton fit into that, and where are we? I hope we're more of a Google than a pets.com, but what we're trying to do is basically decarbonize energy by taking advantage of the existing infrastructure and assets that are out there around the world, namely oil and gas deposits that have already played out to a large extent. So there's a lot of oil fields that once they depressurize, they're no longer economically producing oil and gas, but they still contain huge amounts of oil and gas that just can't make its way through the rock grains to a production wellbore. So in that regard, it's interesting to think about the amount of trapped energy. Hydrocarbons are hydrogen and carbon, and the other fluid in reservoirs is H2O, it's water. So you have these hydrogen-rich, energy-dense systems within nature's pressure vessels below geological seals. And what we do at Proton, our concept is pretty straightforward. We inject pure oxygen from the air into these fields in order to trigger reactions with the oil that release other reactions that cause the liberation of CO2 and hydrogen. The CO2 we trap in the ground by injecting wastewater streams that are reactive with CO2 to form carbonates. So within the bottom water pore space of an oil field, you can end up with a significant amount of carbonate deposited down there. And when you form that carbonate, it releases additional hydrogen. So the system works quite nicely to enable very low cost production because the fuel is essentially free and the pressure vessel, the reaction container, is the oil field pore space itself. And the wells are already drilled, everything's accessible, and a lot of the infrastructure can be repurposed. A lot of the skills can be repurposed slightly. And it's all within an existing framework and system of regulatory and things like that. So it seems to be getting popular lately. We're selling licenses around the world. The main input cost for us is the cost of oxygen. So the cost of air separation. So the cost per ton of oxygen has a direct correlation to the cost of hydrogen that we produce. So we'll be scaling up to large scale facilities for creating oxygen. And this is something that's going to be, it's twofold. The other main byproduct of air separation is, of course, nitrogen. And the nitrogen can be combined with hydrogen to make ammonia. And ammonia is the world's main fertilizer. There would not be almost 8 billion people if there was no fertilizer. In fact, there would probably be less than 1 billion people if there was no fertilizer, and there'd be more scarcity and wars and difficulties. So it's really enabled us to, I guess, have the, what's the right word? I guess we've come to a renaissance of sorts, but I think it's penultimate. There's more to come that will be much greater as the energy costs drop and as pollution drops. And to me, I'm most passionate about eradicating air pollution. So air pollution kills roughly 10 million people per year, and we can save money while avoiding that. So I'm really hopeful about watching this proliferate quickly around the world. More generally, into the concept of clean energy and clean tech, it won't only be us and our solution. The cost of wind and solar and geothermal is dropping as well. And so these combination of alternatives as they scale up will be tremendous in allowing us to embrace an abundant and clean future that helps us protect our ecosystems. Maybe one small further thing I'll comment on is a significant challenge for ecosystems is humans wanting food. It's understandable. Everybody likes to eat. Clearly, I do. Maybe I eat a little too much, but it's a different subject. And I think that there are significant improvements to be made, whether it's vertical farming, tunnel agriculture, different microbial feedstocks that we can all pivot more increasingly toward in order to reduce our ecological load on the biosphere of Earth. So a lot of these, the rate of extinctions is, appalling. The rate of walking mammal meat, I've saw an index for that. Compared to 1970, we're something like 1/3 of the amount of natural animals out there, mammals, that there used to be. And that's just a proxy as well. There's obviously other natural plants and other insects and things like that, where populations are plummeting and extinctions are ongoing at alarming, like truly alarming rates. And it's largely to do with people wanting to eat and the processing of after we eat what comes next. So low cost energy, low cost hydrogen, clean hydrogen, I think will both play a very meaningful role in the movement towards improving our ecological, making our footprints lighter, I guess you could say. So that's kind of the main points I wanted to go through. I could go into more technical detail on our process, or more implication in politics, or more generally where I think jobs in the economy are going. But maybe I'll turn it back to you to provide a little guidance or ask some questions, and I'm happy to explore topics.
You betcha. Well, I know for myself, I have a couple of questions kind of about the hydrogen and how that all works. I'm not super familiar with that technology, so curious to learn more. So first of all, like, what is clean hydrogen? Like, what's the kind of definition of that?
Sure. Well, clean hydrogen, I guess at its heart, hydrogen is just hydrogen. So when you're wondering about clean, it mostly has to do what is the CO2 footprint. That's the framework through which most governments have agreed to use as a proxy for air pollution and as a concern in relation to greenhouse gas potential within our atmosphere. So some methods of creating hydrogen release a significant amount of CO2, and you can do different chemical reactions involving coal, but the most common worldwide way to make hydrogen today, and in fact, it's more than 95% of how the world's hydrogen is produced, is a process called steam methane reforming, where natural gas, methane, is burned and high temperature steam, which is heated up by burning the methane. They're combined into a pipe together where carbon monoxide and steam go through a process called water gas shift, which liberates hydrogen and CO2. The trouble is the CO2. So in districts like Canada, where there's a very significant carbon tax, you end up with, a very, very expensive burden for making hydrogen. And yeah, I guess if cleanliness and CO2 would be correlated, then it's not preferable to do it the way we mostly do today, including in Alberta, where we make roughly 5,000 tons a day of hydrogen in this way. So Alberta is a pretty big emitter of CO2, and in looking around at ways to reduce the amount of CO2, one concept that has been demonstrated is to try and catch some of those CO2 molecules as they escape from flare stacks and chimneys. Well, from basically the exhaust of a steam methane reforming plant, and that's done using an ammonia-based amine system. It's called. Nitrogen molecules they have an affinity to grab CO2 at a certain pressure temperature band, and if you increase the pressure and temperature, it liberates the CO2 in a more pure form, and then you can basically recycle the nitrogen based molecules and capture the CO2 in that way. The trouble is those nitrogen based molecules are themselves environmentally controversial. So even if you can grab all this CO2 or a lot of it and inject that into the ground, yes, it reduces the CO2, but it adds significant costs and other challenges. And this isn't a district where there's a lot of incentives. If you can imagine you're in a hungry nation where there's a lot of poverty and you need to build a power plant or make hydrogen for fertilizer or things like this, fertilizer being mostly based on ammonia at its heart, it becomes a very easy choice that burning, just simply using natural gas and emitting the CO2 is less expensive. So another way has to be established that's lower cost in order for it to be widely implementable worldwide without any need for carbon taxes and things like that. So that is Proton, and we essentially do steam methane reforming, except without the methane. We just use the unswept oil in the reservoir as fuel. So you can think about it as underground steam reforming, where the carbon remains in the ground, trapped as carbonate rock. Electrolysis has been discussed quite a lot lately. So there is a significant amount of energy required to break a water molecule, H2O, apart, and a significant amount more is required to, or is released when you put hydrogen and oxygen back together, whether that happens in a combustion scenario or within a hydrogen fuel cell. So the other way that is common, most of that other 5% comes from a process called electrolysis. So you introduce the energy by basically electrocuting water with a cathode and an anode. And at one side, you end up with the hydrogen bubbling out, and the other side, you end up with the oxygen bubbling out. So if you look at the molecular mass of, or the atomic mass of hydrogen and oxygen, you can see that with electrolysis, for example, you end up with 1 part hydrogen for 8 kilograms. So if you have like 1 kilogram of hydrogen, you're making 8 kilograms of pure oxygen, which is usually wasted. And it's generally an inefficient process from an economic perspective, but it works well. It's well established and very old technology.
One question that I have is for students and young professionals that are wanting to get into this more and learning more about clean hydrogen, what would you recommend as some good steps or tips to getting into the industry?
Well, I think a basic understanding of the chemistry of water, the hydrogen and oxygen have such an importance in life. So in biology and in so many industrial processes, it's like a really critical piece of the world around us. The rain and snow, the oceans, our bodies are mostly water. And it's really, I guess, I guess there are different aspects. So if you're on the technical side, understanding a little bit about metallurgy and fabrication and permeability of materials and combustion, the basic chemistry of how electrons are shared within a molecule is how to best understand electrolysis. So on one side you have hydrogen, which is just a very simple protons only, more or less, and there's on the other side atmospheric oxygen. And when you get them together, the reason that they release so much energy is because they're rebalancing electrons. And in fact, you actually can harvest those extra electrons, and that gives you the electricity from the hydrogen fuel cell. Combustion is basically the same general concept. It's a rebalancing of electrons, and and exothermic, and releases a bunch of energy. In that case, much more thermal energy than electrical energy. But understanding, I'm sure there's courses on it, and it all sort of fits together. From my background, I'm a geologist initially, and understanding the reservoirs and the energy where this comes from. Part of it is the flow through porous media. All the typical stuff geoscientists think about applies to one aspect of this: geomodeling and reservoir simulation. And on the engineering side, there's a lot of material science questions, like with hydrogen, because it's such a tiny molecule, and it's a supercritical fluid above something like 3 Kelvin. So it's always got weird properties, and it escapes easily. And being able to design around that and maintain the necessary safety limits, and understand the reasons for the safety of material safety is definitely a huge asset to a career in hydrogen. So I guess the basics of that, and there's lots of good YouTube videos too. Never underestimate the value of YouTube. And and then there's geopolitics around it. So if you have some fresh water and some electricity, you can actually do electrolysis to provide your own fuel for a hydrogen fuel cell car, for example. So that makes it much more of a less of a geopolitical tool. Whereas, for example, oil, if you have a diesel engine and a whole bunch of your economy is reliant on it, and you're importing diesel, that gives an enormous trade imbalance where you're sending a huge amount of your country's money over to countries that happen to have lots of oil and or refining capacity. So I think it's a democratization type of movement as well, where hydrogen, because it can be made just about anywhere without any toxic byproducts, it's really, going to help, let's say, normalize the opportunities around the world.
Nice to meet you, Grant. I'm Justus. I actually just got back from the Canadian Hydrogen Convention in Edmonton. Obviously, hydrogen is a very young industry. Where do you see that industry going in, say, the next 10 years? 10 years as opposed to maybe the next 50 years? What's the difference? What are some realistic goals?
Sure. Yeah, I was at the hydrogen conference as well. I'm on my way back to Calgary, but I'll start by saying I initially went to my first hydrogen conferences in 2017. One was in Sacramento, one was in Prague in the Czech Republic. And I was so excited that there was like 300 people from around the world who showed up at these conferences. And it was mostly the same faces at both conferences, or it felt that way. But, it was a very small niche thing of an excited group who sort of saw the writing on the wall and understood that this is going to be very, very profoundly different and grow quickly. Now in Edmonton, which is, well known to be an oil and gas centric area, and, very significant heavy industry in petrochemicals, to see thousands of people show up to this event shows me that the education level has started to really tip towards mainstream acceptance. And in fact, it's a mainstream conference organization that is making real money off of a giant hydrogen show now. So I think that as this education expands, like I expect there will be much more people attending next year and in different other venues around the world. But where will we be as a result of this awakening in 10 years? I think it's going to be quite profound how fast this happens. So some places much faster than others. In Norway, there's 20 or 30 hydrogen focused pure play hydrogen companies on the stock exchange. In Canada, there's not. There's maybe just 2 or 3, Ballard Power being a notable strong name in hydrogen that's been around for a long time, fuel cell vehicles. And so I think in Europe, I've had a lot of conversations with investors here and there. They are further ahead by several years. So you can get a bit of a sense of at least the near term by looking what's going on over there. In Norway, which is a country with a population similar to Alberta's and a physical size similar to Alberta's, there were hydrogen fueling stations all across the country. So people who want to drive hydrogen cars can do so. There were hydrogen ferries. Everybody kind of knows that it is a massive part of decarbonizing various parts of the economy. So I expect we'll see that in 5 years. It's mainstream. We'll have fueling stations around, and everyone will just kind of have the knowledge and feeling that it's a big part of how we transport goods and things like that. Locomotives and more and more of that will happen. Proton will be starting selling baseload electricity made from hydrogen within the next year or so. And then we'll be supplying other power plants with hydrogen for baseload electricity. So like I mentioned, getting the cost of hydrogen lower than natural gas is key to dramatically changing the uptake rate, because everybody likes to save a bit of money or make a little money. And if you can do more of that, literally burning less money, then it's a really good thing for the whole economy, and individuals are much more motivated by greed than concern for the environment, sadly. But I guess that works to the benefit of quick adoption. So in 10 years, I believe that Alberta will be producing something like 50 to 80,000 tons per day of hydrogen. Today, it's 5,000 tons per day. I think there will be decarbonized methods implemented in 10 years, and will be in the 50,000 to 80,000 tons per day range, which means a significant portion of our transport fuel and electric grid, and some amount of exports, which I think some will be hydrogen, some will be ammonia in terms of exports. But Europe will be further ahead than that. So, for example, we announced a deal a few days ago in the North Sea, where one of our licensees wants to be producing 5,000 tons a day offshore from old oil platforms. And they wanted to do it as quick as they can, partly for energy and I guess food security reasons, and partly because it just makes economic sense. So yeah, I guess as more people view it as an opportunity rather than this weird new thing or a risky thing, it'll just go faster and faster, and the uptake as it goes more and more mainstream will accelerate further. So yeah, 50 years from now or 30 years from now, like obviously profoundly different, but even 10 years from now, it's going to be, in my opinion, my prediction, like pretty seriously different.
Thanks so much. Appreciate all of the detail and the answers. It's fantastic. We have a question in the Q&A here. It says that, so you mentioned that Norway is equipped to make hydrogen fuel use easy. What is involved in changing our current infrastructure to be able to accommodate for hydrogen? Is this like a very large scale change, or can our current grid support it? Or how does that kind of impact those structures?
There's three main ways to move hydrogen. The first, largest, and easiest is power lines. So just make electricity at the site that the hydrogen's produced, and use the existing power lines to move the energy around to charge up electric vehicles and all that kind of stuff, power homes and data centers and everything else. The second easiest is pipelines. So that's going to be, I think, initially begin as a blending into hydrogen pipelines. And then eventually in some locations, there will be more and more hydrogen, pure hydrogen pipelines. And we'll start building more hydrogen compatible pipelines as we go, which I've been speaking for years. I think all new pipelines in Alberta and everywhere should be hydrogen compatible. But anyways, that's a separate one. If it's blended into natural gas, you can pull out significant amounts of it. There is lots of existing technologies that enable this. So it's not a mysterious or untested concept. So you pull out basically a serious amount. So if you maybe push it down the line with 20% hydrogen blended in, you can pull out a lot of that 20% later. So when it gets to people's furnaces and appliances, it ends up being maybe only 1 or 2% hydrogen at the end of the line. Or you can just, if you can make it cheaper than natural gas, just use it in people's furnaces and appliances. The next way is the virtual pipeline. So if you liquefy hydrogen and put it on the back of trucks and trains and ships, that's something that I think will also be happening quite quickly in parallel, but on a much smaller scale. So the hydrogen transportation sector is in its infancy today, and there's not much extra dedicated stuff, and it's high value, high expense, and relatively niche. The way I see this growing is, for example, if we have a facility that's doing 1,000 tons a day hydrogen, I hope that we give away 10 or 15 tons a day to the locals who can just come fill up their fuel cell or hydrogen blend tanks for free. And in that way, sort of encourage the adoption of those types of technologies. And then as that fleet grows, it'll hit a critical mass, and pretty soon people will start noticing the value of changing over their fueling stations. And as new ones get built, there will be a hydrogen thing instead of just diesel and gasoline. And it'll be a gradual transition over probably the next 15 or 20 years, at which point it'll be more of an unusual and niche thing to find diesel and gasoline fueling stations. And then I guess you can transport it as ammonia. That's talked about a lot for overseas transport as an export to places like Japan and Korea, who are basically already have tested a significant amount related to burning ammonia in turbines. So ammonia is something that in the 1930s in Europe, they had buses that were ammonia powered, internal combustion. And a lot of the big ships can store, without too many changes in how they're designed, they can store ammonia that they burn in internal combustion engines. So there's no CO2 emissions because there's no carbon in the fuel molecule, ammonia being NH3. And so for overseas exports, that will continue to be a part of it. And it doubles because ammonia is also, like I mentioned, a direct fertilizer and also a precursor feedstock to just about every fertilizer system. So it's a more versatile system. I don't like the idea of an entirely fully electric grid because it places an economy at risk. So if there's a big solar storm, then we can end up with very, very serious problems with like trying to rebuild transformers and infrastructure. Whereas right now it's pretty good, pretty resilient that we have natural gas distribution and electrical distribution, because if it was one or the other and one went down for a couple of years, it'd be a huge problem. So I'm a, for society's benefit, I think we should have hydrogen pipelines and hydrogen appliances and hydrogen vehicles mixed in and alongside electric vehicles and electrical appliances and all that. So for resilience.
100%. That's a great answer. And I didn't even think about something like that, like a potential solar storm. Like thinking about those things long term is so crucial. So I really appreciate that answer. We have another question here from the Q&A. Is hydrogen a viable fuel for the north and remote areas where access to energy is very costly and traditionally inaccessible?
Yes, is the short answer. So we have a field site in relatively remote part of Saskatchewan. And sometimes during the shoulder season, there's partial load weight restrictions or even road bans. So for battery electric, if you're in minus 35, and never say never, there could be some big breakthroughs in battery technology and storage. But for now, if you're in minus 35 and running 24/7, and it's a extra heavy system for all the battery mass, I think it's a much, much tougher sell to imagine, especially heavy transport trucks and stuff like that, and industrial mining gear running on battery only. Whereas hydrogen can be stored as liquid for a very, very long time. There's a little bit of boil off that happens, but it's not significant, and the technologies for controlling boil off continue to improve. So I guess the short answer is yes. It's less expensive than diesel and gasoline, and the logistics of moving diesel around and big diesel generators, I think, are more challenging. There's lots of examples already where remote mines are doing electrolysis from renewables, and they can make their own fuel right on site with water. So I definitely think there's enormous advantages. If you look across like the Greek and Croatian islands is another example. There's all these islands that have a relatively small population, maybe a few hundred or a few thousand people, and they're importing diesel and burning it in these generators. And the logistics of all of this and the politics around this and the air pollution around this in these pristine environments is very strange. Whereas if you have some local geothermal to electrolysis, for example, right there, you can make your own hydrogen without having, a big expenditure to some foreign nation or neighboring country that, So I think, yes, is the short answer. I think it's like much, much better than diesel and gasoline for that reason.
Awesome. Thank you. We have one more question here from the Q&A, and then I think we'll wrap things up. So this one says, what is a hydrogen compatible pipeline? Can existing pipelines be used for it? Do the pipes need treatment to be able to not corrode, or is it never going to make sense to repurpose existing pipelines?
That's a really good question, and it's one that keeps coming up throughout various contexts throughout time. It comes down to metallurgy and partial pressure of hydrogen. So if you have a very low partial pressure of hydrogen and maybe a fragile metallurgy, you might have no problem. But as you increase the partial pressure of hydrogen, either by increasing the concentration of it in the mix, or by increasing the overall pressure within the pipeline, there will be a point where you run into problems. There are some pipelines that are already compatible with high amounts of H2S. Generally, it's a more nickel-rich metallurgy, and those ones can handle hydrogen. If it can handle high-grade H2S, hydrogen sulfide, then it's already fine. But most pipelines are not rated for that. So the mix does vary depending from pipeline to pipeline, and each needs to be individually tested. Most of them can handle quite a bit if they're relatively low pressure arrival distribution pipelines. The very high pressure main lines are actually the ones that it's toughest to get hydrogen into. I think in general, a lot of them can take 5%. Seems to be well agreed, even the high pressure ones. And then the distributions within cities can go up to maybe 40%. But a lot of the appliances can only handle about 30%. So I think it'll be a range of that type of concept. And some of these main lines, as they get replaced, can have interior coatings or sleeves installed. They can have more ductile metals and nickel-rich metallurgy. And there's a company in Australia called Long Pipes that's building them hydrogen impermeable using composite materials. And I think that third one is going to be kind of the biggest growth segment, where we see more new pipelines made from composite materials than I guess the older days of welded steel.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been super informative, and I feel like we've all learned a lot about kind of the future of hydrogen, which is super exciting. So we really appreciate you taking the time, and yeah, we look forward to connecting in the future and watching where Proton goes with this new technology.
Thanks very much, and thanks for inviting me. It was a pleasure.